The moving truck pulled away from 42 Maple Street, just as the sun was setting on what would become the most eventful summer Willowbrook Estates had ever seen. David Carter stood on his new front porch, watching the truck disappear around the corner, and took his first real breath in months. After 8 years of military service that had taken him to places he couldn't talk about, and situations that still visited him in his dreams, this quiet suburban street felt like heaven. The house was nothing fancy. A simple 2-story colonial, with white siding and black shutters, just like every other house on the block. David had chosen it specifically because it looked ordinary. He wanted to blend in, to be just another neighbor who mowed his lawn on weekends and brought in his trash cans on time. What his new neighbors didn't know was that the quiet man unpacking boxes had spent the last 8 years as one of the Navy's most elite warriors. David's service record was impressive, though most of it remained classified. 3 combat deployments, countless covert operations and commendations that would never see the light of day. He was part of a special unit that handled situations other people couldn't even imagine. But all of that was behind him now. At 32, he was ready for a different kind of life, a peaceful one. The first few weeks went exactly as he'd hoped. His neighbors were friendly but respectful of his privacy. Mrs. Rodriguez from next door brought over a casserole and chatted about the neighborhood. The family across the street waved from their driveway when they saw him working in his yard. It was normal, and normal was exactly what David needed. He established a routine quickly. Morning runs at 5 a.m. when the streets were empty and quiet. Work on his laptop from his home office, handling security consulting for private companies. Afternoon yard work that kept his hands busy and his mind focused on simple tasks. Evenings reading on his back deck, watching the sunset paint the sky in colors that reminded him why he'd fought so hard to protect this peaceful life for others. David kept his house immaculate, a habit from years of military inspection standards. His lawn was always perfectly trimmed, his driveway swept clean, his mailbox polished. He took pride in maintaining his property, partly from military discipline and partly because he wanted to be a good neighbor. He'd seen enough chaos and destruction in his service years. Creating something beautiful and orderly felt like a small act of healing, but David wasn't the only one watching the neighborhood carefully. 3 houses down, Jerry Walsh spent most of his days positioned at his front window, keeping what he called neighborhood security surveillance. Jerry was a man with too much time and not enough purpose, someone who'd applied to be a police officer twice and been rejected both times. The rejections had left him bitter, but they hadn't dimmed his desire for authority and control. Jerry had noticed David from the first day. A young black man living alone, keeping to himself. In Jerry's mind, this combination spelled trouble. He began what he called routine monitoring, which mostly involved watching David's house through binoculars and noting down everything he observed. When David went for his morning runs, Jerry wrote down the time. When packages were delivered, Jerry noted how long they sat on the porch. When David worked in his yard, Jerry watched and waited for something that looked suspicious. The problem was that David never did anything suspicious. He was polite to neighbors, maintained his property beautifully, and minded his own business. This somehow made Jerry even more convinced that something was wrong. In his experience watching police shows and reading online forums about neighborhood security, the most dangerous people were often the ones who appeared most normal. Jerry wasn't alone in his suspicions. He'd managed to recruit 2 other men who shared his views about neighborhood protection. Tony Reeves was a former mall security guard who'd been let go for being too aggressive with shoppers. He missed having authority over people and jumped at the chance to join Jerry's informal patrol. The third member was Carlos Nunez, a man who spent his days consumed by conspiracy theories and his nights watching videos about citizens' rights and vigilante justice. Together, they formed what they called the Willowbrook Security Patrol. They bought badges online that looked official enough to fool most people at a distance. They installed emergency lights on their personal vehicles and started making regular rounds through the neighborhood. Most residents assumed they were some kind of official security hired by the homeowners association, and Jerry did nothing to correct that impression. Their activities started small. They'd drive slowly past houses they deemed suspicious. take photos of cars they didn't recognize, and ask probing questions of residents they encountered on the street. Many neighbors appreciated having what appeared to be extra security, especially elderly residents who worried about crime. Jerry and his team basked in the positive attention and gradually expanded their operations. David first encountered the patrol on a Tuesday evening in late June. He was bringing in his trash cans from the curb when a white sedan with flashing red and blue lights pulled up beside him. Jerry rolled down his window and studied David with obvious suspicion. "Evening," Jerry said, his tone suggesting this was more interrogation than greeting. "I'm Jerry Walsh, head of neighborhood security. Haven't seen you around before." David set down his trash can and approached the car politely. Years of military training had taught him to assess situations quickly, and he immediately noticed several things that didn't add up. The badges looked cheap and unofficial. The emergency lights appeared to be aftermarket additions. Most importantly, none of these men had the bearing or demeanor of actual law enforcement. "I'm David Carter," he replied calmly. "I moved in about 3 weeks ago. Nice to meet you." Jerry studied him for a long moment, clearly expecting David to seem nervous or intimidated. Instead, David stood relaxed and confident, meeting Jerry's stare without flinching. This was not the reaction Jerry was used to getting from people. He questioned. "We like to keep track of everyone in the neighborhood," Jerry continued, "for security purposes. What kind of work do you do?" "Security consulting," David answered truthfully. He didn't mention that his clients were multinational corporations who needed someone with his particular skill set to assess threats in dangerous parts of the world. Tony leaned forward from the passenger seat. "What kind of security?" David smiled, politely. "The boring kind. Risk assessment, mostly computer stuff." Again, not technically a lie, just not the complete picture. Jerry wasn't satisfied, but he couldn't think of any other questions that wouldn't seem obviously inappropriate. "Well, just remember we keep a close eye on things around here. Any problems, you call us first." He handed David a business card with Willowbrook Security Patrol, printed in bold letters, and a phone number. David took the card and nodded. "I'll keep that in mind. Thanks for stopping by." As the patrol car pulled away, David stood in his driveway for a moment, processing what had just happened. His military training had taught him to recognize potential threats, and these 3 men definitely qualified. They weren't dangerous in the way that enemy combatants were dangerous, but they were civilians playing with authority they didn't have, and that could lead to serious problems. That night, David did something he rarely did anymore. He researched Jerry Walsh and his associates online, using skills he'd learned in intelligence gathering during his military service. What he found confirmed his suspicions. Jerry had a history of complaints filed against him for harassment. Tony had been fired from multiple security jobs for inappropriate behavior. Carlos had posted extensively on forums about taking neighborhood protection into his own hands. David realized he was looking at 3 men who were potentially dangerous, not because they were trained or competent, but because they were untrained and incompetent people with delusions of authority. In his experience, that combination often led to situations that spiraled out of control quickly. He decided to be extra careful and started documenting every interaction he had with the patrol. He also made sure his security cameras were working, properly in position to cover all approaches to his property. David hoped the attention would die down as the novelty wore off, but his instincts told him that these 3 men were just getting started. What David didn't know was that Jerry had already decided he was a problem that needed to be solved. In Jerry's mind, David's calm confidence wasn't the sign of an innocent man being polite to neighborhood security. It was the behavior of someone with something to hide, someone who thought he was smarter than the people trying to protect the community. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reveal just how wrong Jerry's assumptions really were. The second encounter happened exactly 1 week later, and this time, Jerry wasn't alone. David was washing his car in the driveway when the white sedan pulled up again, followed by a second vehicle. 3 men got out, all wearing matching polo shirts with security embroidered on the chest and carrying clipboards like they were conducting official business. Jerry approached with Tony and Carlos flanking him, a formation David recognized as an intimidation tactic. In his military days, he'd used similar approaches when questioning suspected insurgents, but seeing it used on a suburban street in America felt surreal and deeply wrong. "Mr. Carter," Jerry said, his voice carrying more authority than it had the week before. "We need to discuss some concerns that have been brought to our attention." David set down his sponge and turned to face them, keeping his expression neutral and his hands visible. Years of training had taught him that de-escalation started with body language, and he wanted to project calm confidence rather than threat. "What kind of concerns?" David asked. Tony stepped forward with his clipboard. "Multiple noise complaints about loud music in parties. Residents report disturbances coming from your property at inappropriate hours." David almost laughed. He'd lived like a monk since moving in, rarely even turning on his television after 8 p.m., but he kept his expression serious. "That's interesting. Can you tell me who filed these complaints and when these disturbances supposedly occurred?" The question clearly caught Tony off guard. He fumbled with his clipboard for a moment before Jerry stepped in. "We protect the privacy of residents who report concerns, but I can tell you that the complaints are verified and documented." "I'd like to see the documentation," David said calmly. "And I'd also like to know what authority you have to investigate these complaints. Are you employed by the Homeowners Association?" Carlos spoke up for the first time. "We don't have to answer your questions. You're the one under investigation. Here." David studied Carlos for a moment, noting the man's aggressive posture and the way his hand kept moving toward his belt, where David could see the outline of what looked like a stun device. These men were escalating the situation, turning what should have been a simple conversation into a confrontation. "Actually," David said, his voice remaining perfectly calm, "since you're on my property making accusations, I think I have every right to ask questions, starting with seeing some identification that proves you have authority to be here in an official capacity." Jerry's face flushed red. He wasn't used to people questioning his authority, especially people he'd already decided were problematic. "We're trying to resolve this peacefully, Carter. But if you want to make this difficult, we can escalate through proper channels." "What proper channels?" David asked. "I'm genuinely curious. If you're not employees of the HOA and you're obviously not law enforcement, what proper channels do you have access to?" The three men exchanged glances. David could see they hadn't expected to be questioned so directly. Most people they dealt with were either intimidated by their official-looking presentation or grateful for what appeared to be extra security. David was clearly neither. Tony tried a different approach. "Look, we're just trying to keep the neighborhood safe and peaceful. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding about the noise complaints, but we've also had reports about suspicious activities at your residence, such as people coming and going at unusual hours, packages being delivered frequently, windows covered so nobody can see inside." David almost smiled at that one. "You mean the curtains? That most people use for privacy?" Carlos stepped closer, trying to use his height to intimidate. "Don't get smart with us. We know how to handle troublemakers." For the first time since the conversation started, David's expression hardened slightly. Not in an obvious way that the three men would notice, but his military training was kicking in. Carlos had just made what could be interpreted as a threat, and David's mind automatically began calculating response options. "Gentlemen," David said, his voice still calm but carrying a subtle edge that hadn't been there before. "I think this conversation has gone far enough. I've been polite and cooperative, but I'm not going to stand here and be threatened on my own property by people who refuse to show proper identification or explain their authority." Jerry sensed that he was losing control of the situation. "We're not threatening anyone. We're conducting a legitimate investigation based on resident complaints." "Then, I'd like to file a complaint of my own," David said, "about harassment by individuals impersonating security personnel." The word impersonating hit Jerry like a slap. "We're not impersonating anyone. We're legitimate neighborhood security." "Prove it," David said simply. "Show me documentation that proves you're employed by any official entity that has authority in this neighborhood." The three men stood there for a moment, clearly not knowing how to respond. They'd built their entire operation on the assumption that people would simply accept their authority without question. David was the first person to directly challenge them, and they hadn't prepared for this scenario. Finally, Jerry played what he thought was his trump card. "We don't have to prove anything to you, but I can tell you that we have the full support of concerned residents in this neighborhood, and we're not going away." David nodded slowly. "I understand, and I want you to understand something too. I'm a military veteran who values peace and quiet, which is why I moved to this neighborhood. I don't want any trouble with anyone, but I also won't be harassed or intimidated by people who think they can play dress up and push residents around." Something in David's tone made all three men take a step back. Tony later told his wife that there was something in David's eyes that reminded him of the way his drill sergeant used to look at recruits who'd screwed up badly. Carlos would describe it as the look of someone who'd seen real violence and wasn't impressed by their tough guy act. Jerry, however, interpreted David's calm confidence as arrogance that needed to be knocked down a few pegs. In his mind, David was challenging his authority, and that couldn't be allowed to stand. "We'll be keeping a close eye on you, Carter," Jerry said as the three men backed toward their vehicles. "Very close." David watched them drive away, then pulled out his phone and took photos of both license plates. His military training had taught him to document everything when dealing with potential threats, and these three men definitely qualified as potential threats. That evening, David did something he hadn't done since moving to the neighborhood. He called his former commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hughes, who now worked in military liaison with civilian law enforcement. "Hughes," she answered on the second ring. "Colonel, it's David Carter. I need some advice about a civilian matter." There was a pause. Colonel Hughes had served with David for 6 years and knew that he wasn't the type to call for help unless the situation was serious. "What's going on, Carter?" David explained the situation with the fake security patrol, being careful to stick to facts and avoid speculation. When he finished, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. "Carter," Colonel Hughes said finally, "these men are playing a dangerous game, impersonating security personnel, harassing residents, making veiled threats. This could escalate quickly. That's what I'm worried about, ma'am. I don't want trouble, but I also can't let them think they can push me around. It'll just encourage them to target other residents." "You're right about that. Men like this usually escalate until someone stops them. Have you contacted local law enforcement?" "Not yet. I wanted to see if this was just going to blow over, but I don't think it is." "Contact them tomorrow. File a formal complaint and make sure they understand that these men are impersonating security personnel. And Carter, be careful. Guys like this are unpredictable, especially when they feel their authority is being challenged." David thanked his former commander and hung up, but he couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to get much worse before they got better. His instincts, honed by years of combat experience, were telling him that Jerry and his crew weren't going to back down. If anything, they were going to double down and escalate. He was right. Over the next 2 weeks, the harassment intensified dramatically. Jerry's patrol started driving by David's house multiple times each day, often slowing down to take photos or videos. They began stopping by at random hours, claiming to investigate new complaints that were obviously fabricated. One morning, David found a citation stuck to his mailbox for excessive lawn height, even though he'd cut his grass just 2 days earlier, and it was shorter than most lawns in the neighborhood. The citation looked official enough to fool most people, complete with case numbers and legal language about HOA violations. Another time, Tony approached David while he was getting his mail and demanded to inspect his packages, claiming they'd received reports about suspicious deliveries. When David refused and asked to see Tony's legal authority to inspect private mail, Tony became aggressive and accused David of hiding contraband. The breaking point came on a Friday evening when Carlos confronted David's elderly neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, demanding to know why she'd been seen talking to David and whether he'd asked her any inappropriate questions. Mrs. Rodriguez was so shaken by the encounter that she called David in tears, apologizing for bringing him a welcome casserole and worried that she'd somehow gotten him in trouble. That night, David made a decision. He'd tried to handle the situation peacefully, hoping these men would lose interest and move on to easier targets. But they were now harassing innocent neighbors, and escalating their behavior in ways that could put people at risk. David had spent 8 years dealing with bullies on a much larger and more dangerous scale. He knew that bullies only understood one language, and it wasn't polite conversation. These 3 men thought they were dealing with just another suburban resident they could push around. They were about to learn exactly how wrong they were. The confrontation that would change everything happened on a quiet Thursday evening in late July. David was in his garage, working on organizing some storage boxes, when he heard the familiar sound of Jerry's patrol vehicle pulling into his driveway. But this time was different. Instead of just Jerry, Tony, and Carlos, there were 2 additional cars and 6 men total. David stepped out of his garage to find himself facing what looked like a small army. Jerry stood in front, wearing what appeared to be a tactical vest over his security polo shirt. Tony had positioned himself near the mailbox, blocking David's route to the street. Carlos stood by the garage door with 2 men David had never seen before, and a 6th man was recording everything with his phone. The setup was clearly designed to intimidate, and David recognized it immediately as a show of force. These men thought they were dealing with a regular citizen who would be overwhelmed by their numbers and official-looking presentation. They had no idea they were facing someone who'd been outnumbered by actual enemies with real weapons in real combat situations. Jerry stepped forward, pulling out what looked like an official document. "David Carter, you are under citizen's arrest for violation of Homeowners Association regulations, disturbing the peace, and suspicious activity that threatens neighborhood security." David studied the document Jerry was holding, noting immediately that it was obviously fake. The letterhead was wrong, the legal language was nonsensical, and there were spelling errors that no legitimate legal document would contain. But what concerned him more than the fake warrant was the plastic zip ties he could see hanging from Tony's belt and the stun devices 2 of the men were carrying. "Gentlemen," David said calmly, "I need to see your legal authority to make any kind of arrest. Citizens' arrest laws are very specific about when they can be used, and I don't believe any of the circumstances apply here." Carlos stepped forward aggressively. "We don't need to explain anything to you. You're coming with us for questioning." David remained perfectly still, but his mind was racing. These men had moved beyond harassment into what could legitimately be considered kidnapping. They were threatening to detain him illegally. They were armed with weapons, and they clearly had no understanding of the legal boundaries they were crossing. "I'm not going anywhere," David said quietly, "and I'm asking all of you to leave my property immediately." Jerry laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "You don't get to make demands anymore, Carter. We've been watching you for weeks, documenting your suspicious behavior, and we have enough evidence to justify a full investigation." "What evidence?" David asked, genuinely curious what they thought they'd observed. Tony pulled out his own clipboard, clearly proud of his documentation. Frequent packages delivered at unusual hours, windows covered to prevent surveillance, regular departures and returns following no discernible pattern, physical fitness activities consistent with combat training, unusual alertness and scanning, behavior indicating possible military or law enforcement background. David almost smiled at that last one. Tony had actually been observant enough to notice David's situational awareness, but he'd interpreted it as suspicious rather than recognizing it as the behavior of someone trained to assess threats. Ironically, Tony's observation was completely accurate, just completely misunderstood. "So you're arresting me for receiving packages, having curtains, leaving my house, exercising, and paying attention to my surroundings?" David asked. "Do you understand how that sounds?" One of the men David didn't recognize spoke up. "Stop trying to talk your way out of this. We know you're up to something, and we're going to find out what." David realized the situation was about to turn physical. These men had worked themselves up into believing they were conducting some kind of legitimate law enforcement operation, and they weren't going to be talked down. He could see it in their body language, the way they were positioning themselves, the way they kept glancing at each other for confirmation that they were ready to act. What they didn't know was that David had been assessing them from the moment they'd stepped out of their cars. 6 men, but only 2 appeared to be in decent physical condition. 3 were carrying stun devices, but none appeared to have any formal training in how to use them effectively. They were bunched together instead of properly spaced, giving David multiple angles of approach. Most importantly, they were focused on intimidation rather than actually controlling the situation, which meant they weren't prepared for real resistance. David's military training had included extensive instruction in hand-to-hand combat, crowd control, and dealing with multiple attackers. He'd used these skills in real combat situations where the stakes were life and death. These 6 men thought they were overwhelmingly superior in numbers, but David knew better. "Last chance," Jerry said, pulling out his own stun device. "Come with us voluntarily or we'll take you by force." David looked at Jerry for a long moment, and something in his expression made Jerry take an involuntary step backward. For just an instant, Jerry got a glimpse of the man he was really dealing with. Not a suburban homeowner trying to avoid trouble, but a warrior who'd faced down actual enemies in actual combat. "No," David said simply. Jerry nodded to his men and they moved forward. What happened next took less than 45 seconds, but it would be replayed on neighborhood security cameras and social media for months afterward. David moved with a speed and precision that none of the 6 men had expected or prepared for. The first man to reach him was Carlos, who led with his stun device extended like he was trying to tag someone in a children's game. David stepped inside Carlos's reach, used his momentum against him, and put him on the ground with a move so quick that the others barely saw it happen. Carlos found himself face down on the driveway with his arms secured behind his back in a way that made any movement extremely painful. Tony rushed forward to help Carlos, but David was already moving. A simple leg sweep sent Tony sprawling, and before he could get up, David had secured Tony's stun device and was using Tony's own zip ties to restrain him. The 2 unknown men attacked together, thinking numbers would give them an advantage. David moved between them like he was dancing, using their own momentum and confusion to put both men down without throwing a single punch. One found himself restrained with his own zip ties, while the other discovered that his stun device had somehow ended up in David's hand. Jerry and the 6th man, the one who'd been recording, stood frozen as David secured the 4th attacker. The whole thing had happened so fast that Jerry's brain was still trying to process what he'd witnessed. One moment they'd had David outnumbered 6-1. The next moment 4 of his men were on the ground, secured with their own restraints, and David was standing calmly in the middle of his driveway holding 2 stun devices. "Gentlemen," David said, his breathing barely elevated, "I think we need to call the police." Jerry finally found his voice. "You attacked us. We were conducting a legal arrest." David pulled out his phone and dialed 911, never taking his eyes off Jerry and the remaining man. "Hello, this is David Carter at 42 Maple Street. I need police response for an attempted kidnapping and assault by multiple individuals impersonating law enforcement officers." The dispatcher asked if anyone was injured, and David looked around at the 4 men on his driveway. None of them appeared to be hurt, just thoroughly restrained and completely humiliated. "No injuries," David reported, "but I have 6 men detained, who attempted to illegally arrest me using fake credentials and weapons." Jerry was frantically trying to call someone on his own phone, probably hoping to get his story to police first. But David wasn't worried about Jerry's version of events. Everything that had happened was recorded on his security cameras, and he was confident that the footage would speak for itself. Within minutes, David could hear sirens approaching. Jerry was still trying to maintain that they'd been conducting a legitimate arrest, but his voice was shaking and his story was becoming increasingly incoherent. The man who'd been recording had long since stopped filming and was looking around like he wanted to disappear. David remained calm and still, keeping an eye on Jerry and the 6th man while waiting for real law enforcement to arrive. He'd done nothing wrong, used only the minimum force necessary to protect himself, and had evidence to support everything that had happened. What Jerry and his crew didn't know yet was that David's military service record, when revealed to police, would make it very clear that they'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. They'd tried to intimidate and illegally detain someone who'd spent 8 years dealing with threats they couldn't even imagine. The quiet suburban street was about to become very busy as police cars, ambulances, and news crews descended on what would become known as the Willowbrook incident. Jerry's fake security operation was about to be exposed to the entire community, and David's true background was about to transform him from a suspected troublemaker into a local hero. But first, Jerry and his remaining free accomplice were about to learn what it felt like to be questioned by real law enforcement officers about their fake law enforcement activities. And unlike David, they weren't going to remain calm under pressure. The first police car arrived within 4 minutes of David's. Followed quickly by 3 more units and an ambulance. Officer Linda Martinez stepped out of the lead vehicle and immediately assessed the scene with the practiced eye of a 15-year veteran. What she saw was unlike anything she'd encountered in her career. 6 men were scattered across a residential driveway. 4 were secured on the ground with plastic zip ties, appearing uninjured but clearly agitated. 1 man was standing near a white sedan with fake emergency lights, talking rapidly into his phone. And in the center of it all stood a calm, composed black man who appeared completely relaxed despite being surrounded by what looked like the aftermath of a significant altercation. Officer Martinez approached David first, noting his non-threatening posture and the way he kept his hands visible and open. "Sir, are you David Carter? You called this in?" "Yes, ma'am. These 6 men came to my property claiming to arrest me under fake authority. When I refused to go with them, they attempted to detain me by force. I defended myself using minimal necessary force and secured them with their own restraints." Martinez looked around the scene again, trying to process what David was telling her. The 4 men on the ground were clearly restrained, but none appeared to be seriously injured. More importantly, their restraints appeared to be professional-grade zip ties, and they'd been applied with obvious skill. "You did this by yourself?" she asked. 6 men? "Yes, ma'am. I have military training." Before Martinez could respond, Jerry rushed over from his car, still talking on his phone but clearly agitated. "Officer, thank God you're here. This man attacked us while we were conducting a legitimate security investigation. He's dangerous and should be arrested immediately." Martinez held up her hand to stop Jerry's rush of words. "Sir, I need you to step back and wait your turn. I'm gathering information from all parties." Jerry's face flushed red. He wasn't used to being dismissed, especially by law enforcement he expected to support his version of events. "You don't understand. We're neighborhood security. We have authority here." "What kind of authority?" Martinez asked, her tone shifting to the professional skepticism she used with suspects who made questionable claims. Jerry fumbled for his fake badge and the printed warrant he'd tried to serve on David. "We're licensed security professionals conducting an investigation based on resident complaints." Martinez examined the documents Jerry handed her, and her expression grew increasingly serious. The badge was obviously fake, purchased online rather, than issued by any legitimate authority. The warrant was even worse, filled with legal language that made no sense and printed on regular computer paper. "Sir, where exactly did you get this badge?" "It's issued by the state for security professionals," Jerry lied, his voice becoming less confident. Martinez pulled out her radio and called for backup from the fraud division. She'd seen enough fake documents in her career to recognize them immediately, and these were particularly poor examples. More concerning was the fact that 6 men had attempted to arrest someone using these fake credentials. Officer James Rodriguez arrived from the 2nd unit and began interviewing the 4 restrained men. What he heard made the situation even more serious. All 4 admitted they'd come to David's property to arrest him. All 4 confirmed they'd intended to take him somewhere for questioning, and none of them could provide legitimate authority for their actions. "So let me get this straight," Rodriguez said to Tony, who was still zip-tied on the driveway. "You came here with weapons to arrest this man for receiving packages and having curtains?" Tony's story sounded increasingly ridiculous when repeated back to him by a real police officer. "We had evidence of suspicious activity. We were protecting the neighborhood." "From what? A man who keeps his lawn neat and minds his own business?" While the officers interviewed Jerry's crew, Martinez continued talking with David. What she learned transformed her understanding of the entire situation. David wasn't just any military veteran. His service record, when she called it in, came back with flags that indicated classified information and clearance levels that impressed even the dispatcher. "Mr. Carter," Martinez said quietly, "your military record shows some very specialized training. These men had no idea who they were dealing with, did they?" David shook his head. No, ma'am. And I tried to de-escalate the situation multiple times, but they were determined to detain me illegally and I couldn't allow that to happen. Martinez reviewed David's security camera footage on her tablet, and what she saw confirmed everything David had told her. The footage clearly showed 6 men approaching David aggressively, Jerry attempting to serve a fake warrant, and the group moving to physically detain David when he refused to comply. David's response was defensive rather than aggressive, using exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize the threat. More importantly, the footage showed David's remarkable restraint. A man with his training could have seriously injured all 6 attackers, but instead he'd simply immobilized them without causing any significant harm. It was a textbook example of appropriate defensive force. Detective Sarah Kim arrived from the fraud division and immediately recognized the scope of what they were dealing with. After reviewing the fake badges, forged warrants, and illegal weapons, she realized this wasn't just a neighborhood dispute. This was a criminal conspiracy involving impersonation of law enforcement, attempted kidnapping, assault with weapons, and fraud. "How long has this been going on?" Detective Kim asked David. "About 6 weeks. It started with harassment and escalated to tonight's incident." Kim interviewed several neighbors who confirmed David's account. Mrs. Rodriguez tearfully described how Carlos had intimidated her for talking to David. Other residents reported being approached by Jerry's patrol and asked to provide information about David's activities. A picture emerged of systematic harassment that had been building toward tonight's confrontation. What made the case even more serious was the discovery that Jerry's group had been operating throughout the neighborhood for months, collecting fake fines from residents and selling security services based on fabricated crime statistics. They'd scammed elderly residents out of thousands of dollars and had been harassing anyone who questioned their authority. Detective Kim's investigation revealed that Jerry had failed the police academy twice. Tony had been fired from multiple security jobs for excessive force, and Carlos had a history of complaints related to vigilante behavior. Together, they'd created a fake security company that had been terrorizing residents while pretending to protect them. The arrest process was humiliating for Jerry's crew. Real police officers used real handcuffs to detain them, read them actual rights, and loaded them into actual police vehicles. Jerry kept insisting that there had been a misunderstanding, that they were legitimate security professionals who'd been attacked by a dangerous criminal. But Detective Kim had seen David's military record, and she knew exactly what kind of man Jerry had tried to intimidate. David was a decorated Navy SEAL with 3 combat deployments and commendations for operations that were still classified. The idea that such a man was a threat to suburban security was so absurd that Kim had to hide her smile when Jerry kept repeating his accusations. "Mr. Walsh," Detective Kim said as she prepared to read Jerry his rights, "do you have any idea who you just tried to arrest?" Jerry looked confused. "Some guy who's been acting suspicious." "That guy is a highly decorated military veteran who spent the last 8 years protecting people like you from threats you can't even imagine. He's probably saved more lives than you've had hot dinners, and you tried to kidnap him because he receives packages and has curtains." The reality of what they'd done was starting to sink in for Jerry and his crew. They'd spent weeks building up David as some kind of dangerous criminal in their minds, when in reality he was a genuine American hero who'd chosen their quiet neighborhood, specifically because he wanted peace after years of service. As the police cars pulled away with Jerry's crew in custody, David stood in his driveway talking with Officer Martinez about the charges that would be filed. Impersonating law enforcement officers was a felony in their state, and attempted kidnapping could result in significant prison time. "Mr. Carter," Martinez said, "I have to ask, with your training, you could have hurt these men seriously. Why, didn't you?" David looked around his quiet neighborhood, where neighbors were beginning to emerge from their houses after hearing the sirens. "Because this is home now, officer. I didn't serve overseas so I could come back and hurt people in my own neighborhood. I just wanted them to understand that their behavior needed to stop." Martinez nodded, understanding exactly what David meant. She'd seen plenty of veterans struggle with the transition from military to civilian life, but David had clearly found his balance. He'd used his skills only when necessary, with appropriate restraint to protect himself and his community. As the news crews began arriving, drawn by reports of the unusual incident, David realized his quiet suburban life was about to become very public. The story of fake security officers trying to arrest a Navy SEAL was exactly the kind of thing that captured public attention. But David wasn't worried about the attention. He'd handled much more challenging situations in his military career, and he was confident that the truth would speak for itself. Jerry and his crew had created this situation with their illegal behavior, and now they would face the consequences of trying to intimidate the wrong person. The peaceful neighborhood that David had chosen for his retirement was about to become famous, but not for the reasons Jerry had intended. The story broke on local news that same evening and went viral within hours. Fake security patrol tries to arrest Navy SEAL became the top trending story on social media, with David's security camera footage viewed millions of times. The video showed everything clearly. 6 men attempting to illegally detain one calm, composed veteran who defended himself with remarkable skill and restraint. Public reaction was swift and overwhelmingly supportive of David. Comments poured in from veterans, law enforcement officers, and ordinary citizens praising his professionalism and restraint. Many pointed out that David could have seriously injured his attackers but chose instead to simply neutralize the threat with minimal force. Jerry's crew faced a very different reception. Their mugshots were shared widely online, along with details about their fake security operation and the residents they'd harassed and defrauded. Jerry, in particular, became the subject of countless memes mocking his decision to try intimidating a Navy SEAL with a fake badge and plastic zip ties. The legal consequences came quickly. All 6 men were charged with multiple felonies, including impersonating law enforcement officers, attempted kidnapping, assault with weapons, fraud, and conspiracy. Jerry faced additional charges for running the fake security company and defrauding elderly residents. Detective Kim's investigation revealed the full scope of their operation. Jerry's group had collected over $40,000 in fake fines and security fees from neighborhood residents over 8 months. They'd targeted elderly homeowners and new residents who were most likely to be intimidated by their official-looking presentation. Mrs. Rodriguez was among 17 residents who came forward to describe harassment by Jerry's patrol. Her testimony was particularly powerful, describing how Carlos had made her feel afraid in her own neighborhood for the crime of being friendly to a new neighbor. "I lived through much worse than this in my home country," she told Detective Kim, "but I never expected to be bullied in America by people pretending to be police officers." The Homeowners Association held an emergency meeting 3 days after the incident, and the turnout was unprecedented. David attended, partly to answer questions and partly to reassure neighbors that he posed no threat to anyone. What he found was a community eager to apologize for what he'd endured. "Mr. Carter," said Helen Pierce, the HOA president, "we had no idea these men were operating in our neighborhood. If we'd known what was happening, we would have stopped it immediately." David stood to address the packed community center. "I appreciate that, Mrs. Pierce, but I want everyone to understand that I'm not angry with the community. Jerry and his friends acted on their own, and they're facing the consequences of their choices." A man in the back raised his hand. "Is it true that you're a Navy SEAL?" David nodded. "Former Navy SEAL. I served for 8 years before retiring and moving here. I chose this neighborhood because I wanted peace and quiet, and I'm hoping we can all get back to that." An elderly woman near the front spoke up. "Those men took $200 from me for fake security fees. They said there had been break-ins, and I needed to pay for extra patrols." Similar stories emerged throughout the meeting. Jerry's crew had systematically targeted vulnerable residents, using fear tactics to extract money and compliance. They'd created the very insecurity they claimed to be protecting against. The meeting concluded with a unanimous vote to ban any unofficial security patrols from the neighborhood and to implement better communication between the HOA and residents about legitimate security concerns. Over the following weeks, David's life gradually returned to normal, though with some significant changes. Neighbors who had barely acknowledged him before now went out of their way to greet him and chat. Children on the street looked at him with obvious admiration. Mrs. Rodriguez resumed bringing him home-cooked meals, this time with pride rather then nervousness. The media attention was intense but brief. David gave one interview to a local television station, mainly to set the record straight about what had happened and to encourage other veterans struggling with civilian life to seek help when they needed it. Military service teaches you skills that can be intimidating to civilian life, he told the interviewer, but it also teaches you discipline, restraint, and the importance of protecting people who can't protect themselves. That's what I tried to do here. Jerry's trial became a local sensation. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence of his fake security operation, including testimony from dozens of victims and clear video evidence of the attempted arrest. Jerry's defense attorney argued that his client genuinely believed he was protecting the neighborhood, but the jury wasn't convinced. Jerry was sentenced to 5 years in prison for his role as the ringleader. Tony and Carlos each received 3 years, while the other 3 men got suspended sentences and community service in exchange for cooperation with prosecutors. All 6 were ordered to pay restitution to the residents they'd defrauded. The sentencing hearing provided closure for many victims. Mrs. Rodriguez testified about the fear she'd experienced, speaking directly to Carlos about how his actions had made her feel unsafe in her own home. "You took away my peace," she told him. "I came to America to escape people who used fear to control others. You brought that fear into my neighborhood." Judge Patricia Williams was particularly harsh in her sentencing remarks for Jerry. "Mr. Walsh, you created a criminal enterprise based on exploiting people's fears and impersonating law enforcement. Your actions could have led to serious injury or death when you encountered Mr. Carter, a trained professional who showed remarkable restraint in dealing with your illegal behavior. The fake badge and equipment Jerry's crew had used were donated to a police training academy as examples of what officers should watch for when dealing with impersonators. Detective Kim used the case in training sessions about civilian security fraud." 6 months after the incident, David was approached by the Real Homeowners Association about serving on their security committee. The position was volunteer, but it would involve consulting on legitimate security improvements for the neighborhood. "I'd be honored," David told Helen Pierce, "but I want to be clear that I'm interested in real security measures that actually protect people, not the kind of theater that Jerry was running." David's recommendations were practical and effective. Better lighting at key intersections, a HOA neighborhood watch program with proper training and clear limitations, and improved communication with local police. No fake badges, no intimidation tactics, no harassment of residents. The transformation of Willowbrook Estates was dramatic. What had been a neighborhood living in fear of Jerry's patrol became a close-knit community that looked out for each other in positive ways. Property values increased as word spread about the community's resolution of the security situation. David became something of a local celebrity, though he tried to downplay the attention. Children in the neighborhood would sometimes ask him to tell stories about his military service, though he was careful to share only appropriate tales about teamwork and helping people. "The most important thing I learned in the military," he would tell them, "is that real strength comes from protecting people who need help, not from bullying people who can't fight back." A year later, when a national news program did a follow-up story about the incident, they found a completely transformed neighborhood. Jerry's victims had recovered financially and emotionally from their experience. The community had implemented effective security measures based on cooperation rather than intimidation. David had fully settled into civilian life, working as a security consultant for businesses that needed genuine expertise rather than fake authority. He'd also begun volunteering with veteran support groups, helping other former military personnel make the transition to civilian life. "The irony," David told the news reporter, "is that Jerry and his crew were so worried about suspicious activity in the neighborhood that they never realized they were the suspicious activity. They created the very problem they claimed to be solving." Mrs. Rodriguez, now a close friend and frequent dinner guest, had the last word in the interview. "David is what a real protector looks like. Quiet, respectful, and strong when he needs to be. Jerry was just a bully with a fake badge." The Willowbrook incident, as it came to be known, became a case study in law enforcement training about the dangers of civilian impersonation and the importance of proper background checks for security personnel. It was also used in veteran transition programs as an example of how military skills could be properly adapted to civilian situations. David Carter had moved to Willowbrook Estates looking for peace and quiet. Instead, he'd found a community that needed protection from the very people claiming to protect it. His response had been measured, appropriate, and ultimately transformative for everyone involved. The quiet suburban street that Jerry had tried to control through fear had become a model of community cooperation and mutual respect. And the man Jerry had tried to intimidate had become the neighborhood